The promise of the 1950s nuclear family was that the husband would make the money at a paying job, and the wife would stay home and take care of the children and the housework.
Father's main work is away from home, so much of the housework falls on mothers.
But many women wanted to work outside the home, and with second-wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s, that was becoming more and more common. There was a movement for women to enter the sphere of paid work. But was there a similar movement for men to enter the sphere of housework? Let's talk about it. Arlie Hochschild was a sociology professor at UC Berkeley in the 1970s and 80s. She was driven to get tenure, and her hard work paid off. She became a tenured sociology professor at the #1 sociology department in the country at the time. Then she had her first child, and she started to feel the strain that so many working mothers feel. When she was breastfeeding her infant son, she brought him into her office and kept a box with blankets for him in the corner. She couldn't help but notice that the baby in the corner made many of her colleagues and students uncomfortable. She noticed that her male colleagues didn't bring their babies to work, and also they didn't seem to feel as conflicted about being at work as she did. Around this time, she read about a study of over 1,200 working parents that found that working women averaged 3 hours a day on housework, while men averaged 17 minutes.
Do you ever do housework?
Well, from time to time. I mean, I don't make a habit of it. I have other things to do. I have a wife to do housework.
Working fathers watched television an hour longer than their working wives and slept a half hour longer each night. This landmark study, conducted by Alexander Salai, told the story of working women's double work shift. Their first shift at their paying job, their second shift at home. But what Salai's study didn't say was how the men and women felt about the second shift. Hochschild had a lot of her own feelings about it, and she was curious how other couples were feeling about the division of labor in their homes.
Isn't there a better way to manage ourselves?
So she got to work. She interviewed 50 couples a handful of times and 12 couples in depth. For the in-depth study, she interviewed those 12 couples over the space of 8 years, spending days in their homes watching their dynamic, chatting with them, chatting with their kids and their babysitters. She interviewed each of the 12 couples extensively, noting who cooked, who vacuumed, who cared for the plants, who washed the car, and of course, how did they both feel about who did what. Her findings? On average, across race and class divisions, the women in her study were doing the vast majority of the second shift work. In most of the homes she studied, husband and wife both returned from work at the same time, but then the wife made dinner while the husband read the paper. The wife did the dishes while the husband watched TV. So women had moved into paid work, but men had not moved into housework at nearly the same rate. This led to what Arlie Hochschild called a stalled revolution, where women were vastly different from their mothers, but men were pretty similar to their fathers. The result? A lot of overworked women as society struggled to balance the workload at home. But don't men work more in the office, so it makes sense for women to work more at home? Let's see what Hochschild found. Combining paid work, housework, and childcare, Hochschild discovered that women on average worked 15 more hours per week than men. Adding up those 15 hours over the course of a year, women worked a full extra month of 24-hour days compared to men each year. Over a dozen years, that's a full extra year. Not only were women facing a wage gap in the workplace, at home, they were facing a leisure gap. Why was this happening? Well, part of the problem was a vast difference in expectations. The women entering the workforce were expecting an equal marriage. They were expecting their lives to look similar to those of their husbands. But the husbands weren't expecting their lives to look like their wives' lives. They were expecting their lives to look like their fathers' lives. Some findings that Hochschild cites in her book back up this expectation gap. In a study of Berkeley seniors, 69% of women expected to share laundry equally, but only 38% of men. 50% of women expected to share the cooking, but only 31% of men. 54% of women expected to be the one who would miss an important meeting at work for a sick child, but only 13% of men. That's a big gap. And this gap manifested again when it came to gratitude. The men in the study all thought that their wives should be grateful to them for doing more housework than their fathers had done. But the wives largely weren't comparing their husbands to their fathers, they were comparing the husband's workload to their own workload. Interestingly, even though every woman in the study except one wished that her husband would help more, every single woman did report feeling thankful for her husband when she compared him to what Hochschild calls the going rate for men. And they were often right for doing so. This didn't mean that their marriages were equal, but that the men were doing more than most men were. This, combined with the fact that divorce hits women much harder than men economically, made the women grateful for what they could get. Okay. Imagine 2 oxen yoked together plowing a field side by side during the day. Once the sun sets and the fieldwork ends, one ox is unyoked, free to graze and rest. The other ox, however, is led back to the barn and hitched to a heavy cart, tasked with hauling water and supplies back to the barn so that the first ox has food, water, and a clean place to sleep. Though both worked equally in the field, only one continues laboring into the night, supporting the other's comfort at the expense of its own rest and well-being, only to do it all over again the next day and the next day for months and years on end. Now imagine that the overworked ox looks over to the well-rested ox and expresses its gratitude that the well-rested ox lets it work. Does that seem strange? Such was the plight of working women in the 1980s, and maybe even now. So how did these women deal with the unfairness? A variety of ways. Some tried to be supermoms, doing it all and happy to do it. Some left their husbands. Many got sick with migraines, ulcers, depression, exhaustion, and panic attacks. But all of them dealt with managing resentment towards having to do a second shift.
I got those house cleaning blues.
In order to make this unfair arrangement manageable, Hochschild notes that both men and women had to rely on something to reconcile these mismatched expectations while staying relatively sane. That thing was what she called a family myth. Here's what a family myth looked like for one couple, Nancy and Evan. They both worked full-time, and Nancy wanted an equal marriage. Her husband, Evan, also said he wanted an equal marriage, but when it came to sharing the load, it just wasn't happening. 2 months after their first child was born, Nancy reached a breaking point. Something had to change. So she made a plan. She wrote lists. She presented her new plan to Evan, which included them taking turns cooking dinner every other night and equally sharing the laundry. On Nancy's night to cook, she would cook. But on Evan's night to cook, he would forget or say he was too tired. After months of frustration and conflict, Nancy gave up. She conceded. The truth was, she didn't want a divorce more than Evan didn't want a divorce. Nancy would do the physical work of the second shift alone, and she would also do the necessary emotional work to cope with her concession. She told herself the myth that everything was fine and everything was fair. She compared Evan to husbands who did less. She focused on her gratitude that he took care of the dog. But her resentment didn't go away. It required constant management. Interestingly, the husbands in Hochschild's study who professed to want a traditional marriage where the man's place was at work and the woman's place was in the home, in actuality did more housework than the husbands who claimed to be in transitional marriages, as in transitioning from traditional to more modern, so-called equitable marriages. Of all the traditional men, 22% shared, 44% did a moderate amount, and 33% did little. Of all the transitional men, 3% shared, 10% did a moderate amount, and 87% did little. The transitional men relied on the myth that everything was fair and even, when it demonstrably was not. But this book was published in 1989. Surely things are different now. Well, yes and no. Some things have changed, some things have not. In a study conducted 25 years after Hochschild's, researchers found that working moms put in an extra 5 to 7 more hours of the second shift than working dads. which adds up to 2 weeks of 24-hour days of more work. In Hochschild's study, it was 4 extra weeks per year. That means that men's housework doubled from 1989 to 2005. That's awesome progress, but we're not to equity. A 2023 report from the Pew Research Center found that wives are still spending more than double the amount of time on housework than their husbands. 4.6 hours per week for women versus 1.9 hours per week for men, and almost 2 hours more per week on caregiving, including tending to children. Husbands, meanwhile, spend roughly 3 hours more per week than their wives on paid work, and 3.5 hours more on leisure activities. So while men these days definitely do more around the house than they did in the 1970s, a sizable gap remains. Thankfully, there's some great work being done in this space, and one of my very favorite educators and activists working on household gender equity is Paige Connell at She Is a Page Turner on Instagram. I asked Paige what she thinks the next steps are.
So I really do think starting at home is a huge thing to do, right? Because if we can make these small changes in our homes, that will flow out into the world, right? It might not change everyone's life, but it'll change someone's life. And so when I think about the things that we've tried to do, at least in our home, is first and foremost within our marriage, my husband and I, finding equity. Equity, not just in the sense of like who does what chore, equity when it comes to our time, right? I want free time. I want to go to yoga. I want to see my friends. I want to spend 6 hours on a Saturday doing whatever the heck I want and not telling you when I'm going to come home, right? Like, I want to do that too. Finding equity. And somebody asked me this the other day, why don't you say equal? Because equal is just like not possible ever, especially as parents, right? Like our lives ebb and flow. Our kids need different things. Our jobs need different things. Life is always evolving. And so we just want it to be fair, right? And so working at home on those things in whatever way works best for you. But then there's the conversations we're having with other people outside of our home, which is half the reason I'm on social media, which is before I started talking about it, I felt really alone. And I felt like there was really no solution. And once I started talking about it, thousands of women were like, oh my God, me too. And men. I have men who message me and they're like, thank you so much. I couldn't understand it. I didn't know what she was talking about. And now I feel like I have a better idea of it. And so talking to your friends, talk to your mom, talk to your sister, talk to your brother, talk to people at work about these things. Bring it up. If you have HR and you feel like there are biases against women, like talk about these things. And I know that's hard to do for a lot of us. You can make change at home. You can make change in your community. You can make change in your schools. You can make change in, your workplace. You can make change. You just kind of have to be loud about it. Simply being willing to have a conversation with someone goes a very, very long way. And recognizing that this is not an individual failure of any one person helps us navigate these conversations more easily when we can say, hey, like, none of us did this to ourselves, right? This happened. This is how we can go forward.
Thank you so much, Paige. The key to unstalling the revolution, according to Hochschild, is for everyone, from our governments to our companies to all of us, to start truly valuing and sharing in the duties of caring for loved ones. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, forward this video to someone else, and then leave your comments below.